Talk about pill testing only from a historical point of view, because now we like to talk about drug checking.
Okay,
But just seriously, to get a bit of an idea, and I'll talk about where we started, but these days there's not a lot of pills out there, or there's pills, but it's changing, it's turning to other types of drugs. So we now talk about drug checking. It's just, a little thing. Anyway, I started in this trade back in late 90s. So I run pillreports.com. I was also involved with Blue Light drug forums, which started in 98, 97, and pill reports came out of that. And the work that I was involved with in Australia was people that were looking around what was happening overseas and looking at people like Dan Safe in the US and people in Europe that were doing the same sort of like peer-based activities, and we were seeing what they were doing, but most importantly what was different was they were doing drug checking at that time, and pill testing. There was a lot of that going on in a lot of these countries. And it seemed like the obvious thing to be doing. The quality of the drugs and the adulterants that were in them were very much the thing which a large majority of the reason why people were getting into trouble with drugs were due to adulterants, or not getting the drug that they expected. So we looked at this and saw this was happening overseas, why isn't it happening here? And we as people on these online boards, sort of, we were interested. We went to these organisations and said, so why aren't you pill testing? And the answer that came back was basically, we can't, because we're all government funded in one way or another, and the government won't let us. That's what it comes down to. The entire harm reduction industry in Australia is based on government funding, and that's really what it comes down to. So nothing brave, even though something that's been being done in Europe for literally close to 30 years now, can't be attempted in Australia. So we looked at that and kind of went, well, what are we going to do? And we decided to do it. So we formed an organisation that was essentially from day one an activist organisation, because we realised that what we're doing was an illegal act. Under Australian law, it would be illegal for us to test drugs. The way they can get away with it in other countries is an interpretation of common law, or either working with actual law changes. But the idea is that when someone's testing a pill, they're destroying what they're testing, and so they can't be charged with that possession. Because it all comes down to that. The drug tester will be in possession of a drug while testing it. That's a very fundamental point of it. Now, in the US, they could work around that with interpretation law. Under Australian law, we found out very quickly, after getting a lot of very pricey legal advice, was that King Williams versus the King, a particular court case, said that if a drug is on the table here, all of us could be charged with possession of that because we are in control of that drug. That's how Australian law works. That meant that we were immediately out of the gate knew that we were going to be breaking the law. But we went, fuck it, something needs to be done. So we went, I had a meeting with all the people involved, and we knew this was going to happen, and said, okay, we've got two choices here. We can either, again, do nothing and wait for other organisations to do nothing because they can't, or we can do it. So we did that. We became an activist organisation, and we intentionally went out there and said, we're doing this, arrest us if you dare. Because we knew that, the publicity involved in that would actually force things through. And so I spent a large amount in that, I was from about 2001 onwards through about 2005. I spent a lot of time, testing at events and doing that, but also a lot of time in the media space, talking about this, getting in people's faces, and pissing off Christopher Pine at the time. But more importantly, the drug checking thing had to be done at that time because ecstasy use was going upward, massively upward in Australia. It was becoming a more of a normalised thing. People in all walks of life were doing it. And surprisingly enough, there wasn't as many people dying as you would have thought, but people were still dying, and people were getting into trouble, and bad things were happening, but it could have been so easily, at that stage, been helped by doing some very simple things that would have been done. The thing about harm reduction is, and harm minimisation that we're talking about here at the moment, this massive gap. The things that happen here with these organisations is all about the very end, after someone has taken their drugs, and when something bad has gone on. There's a whole immediate stage before that, before someone takes the drug, where we can intervene and do something and reduce the harm before it happens. Medicine's based around the idea of prevention being better than cure, and we do not do anything at all like that in this regard. Drug policy is supply reduction, demand reduction, harm reduction. We know it's massively weighed out by supply reduction, demand reduction. We know that fails because we still want to take the drugs that are still made and pour into the country. But then there's this big gap here before you end up, in one of these tents, puking your guts up. So we thought, there's something that could be done there. And we did it. We did it with some flawed technology, with a little reagent test and doing whatever. We did what we could. Then we tried to make the next step by buying the impressive lab gear to be able to do it on the spot. Now at that stage we were going to drop $20,000 on the same bit of gear that when you go through the airport, they swipe your baggie. You know that? That little bit of gear, you know, we were going to buy for $20,000 because that same bit of gear tests for explosives and drugs. So we were going to buy one and test, and then basically negate all of the media, the talking points from the politicians that our tests weren't accurate and were giving false security and this type of thing. We were going to completely go around that. Unfortunately, you know, when you make political enemies who have, you know, power, they will reach out with that power. The Australian government told the company we were going to buy it from that if they sold one to us for $20,000, they would lose a $100 million contract. That's how the system works, and that's how interventionist the federal government at that stage was, being a conservative government. I mean, we all know the history of what happened with the heroin trials and that type of thing as well. It's always been a consistent federal, conservative government, interventionist policy, whatever. So we butted up against that. We also then tried to work out, how can we just buy one of these in the grey market, bring it in the country, see how we go? I mean, look, capitalism works, it's a market supply, let's try that. Then we were told that if we did have one of those bits of equipment, we would be arrested under counter-terrorism laws. Being dual-use equipment that is calibrated for detection of both drugs and explosives, were I, as a citizen, to own that, I would be liable to be prosecuted as a terrorist because I could potentially make a bomb that could go through security. This is to give you, just to show you the resistance that there is in this country to doing something in this gap. Okay? But, so, I've been out of the game for a little while now. Now I'm coming back into it because a few interesting things are happening all around. One of the reasons I got back in, and I was talking to the Will about this when he asked to talk about this area, and it was coincidentally around the time that we had another young girl die. Another 19-year-old girl died. Because I was getting those phone calls again. I would always be the person that would ring up for a quote. You know. And the sad thing was, we'd be different journalists every year, following the same story about the same person dying every year. And now it's been 17 years or something I've been doing it. And it's getting ridiculous. And it's getting worse, and it's getting more and more worrying because like you said the other day, it was like, you know, we're surprised. A girl takes one pill of MDMA and falls over. When does that happen? We don't know what's MDMA.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask.
Okay, this is
PMA
well, no, this is the thing. PMA, PMA was killing people 20 years ago. But new drugs are coming out every week now. We had this whole thing, it's always an acronym, and now it's like NPDs, new psychoactive drugs, I think is the current accepted term for what was started off as designer drugs or went through a whole bunch of different things. But now it's a whole thing of like, we just don't know.
Well, the Murdoch tabloids have been blaming MDMA on every death.
But it doesn't. I'm not going to go into that whole thing. All drugs are dangerous, yes, but some drugs are more dangerous than others. So we're ending up with more and more substances that are coming out every day, and we don't know what they are. And, you know, police intelligence doesn't know what they are until they turn up, because these things are being made legally in various other countries, and then they shift through grey areas and become illegal, and they get scheduled or whatever, and we don't know. And the dosages for them can be incredibly small to incredibly big, and we don't know, and it's just not there. So this is why I'm getting back into it again to go, okay, we need to do something. The technology is getting cheaper and more accessible every day, because everything, like I said, I've been doing this for 15 years. You know, my phone is a hell of a lot smaller, a hell of a lot cheaper, a hell of a lot more powerful than it was then. And that's not just a random, you know, bit of tech and pulling out of the air, because now they're looking at, you know, I invested in a Kickstarter like a little while ago for a $200 device that hooks up to your smartphone, that you press a button, it zaps and can identify material and use the app on the phone to talk to the cloud. Right? This analytical stuff is coming because all of this is accelerating, and all this technology is getting, you know, both for the detection and for the manufacture of drugs. This stuff is happening faster and faster and faster. Stuff needed to be done 10 years ago. It wasn't. We now need to look at what can actually be done now.
Well, I think we've got to look at the way.
Hang on.
Sorry.
Yeah. So that's why I'm coming back into this now, to look at what can possibly be done. Because harm reduction and harm minimisation, like I say, it just isn't serious about reducing harm beforehand. It's only about picking up the pieces afterwards. Now, if we have a tacit understanding that people go to events and take drugs, as they do in lots of other places, in lots of other workplaces and everywhere, but if they do take them at events, if we can prevent the harm beforehand, then we can do something. Or we can just pick up the pieces afterwards.
Do you think there's any evidence where not pill testing, what's it called now?
Drug checking
is done, routinely as part of the culture that has a kind of a feedback effect on the manufacturers of the drugs?
Absolutely. The Netherlands have been drug checking for 30 years now, and you only have to look at the supply in the Netherlands to know that there's a direct causal relationship between the checking of it and it. And they also have very, very accurate intelligence. I think you were talking before about the medical people on site knowing what bad batches are around there, whatever. The information that we have in Australia, if you've got it at all, will be based on police reports that are on lab reports that are 3-6 months out of date. This is the thing, we don't have drug intelligence in this country that works. If we do, it's held tightly by the police and not shared with anyone. The user has no access to that information. That's the thing. I've always come from representing users, the people that use the drugs. That's the people who harm. That's my stakeholder. Is the people that use the drugs. No one is really looking out for them in this area of harm reduction until they fall over. Okay? Harm reduction in other areas of drugs. Australia led the way with NSPs, injecting rooms, and this type of thing. That's fantastic. That is before the moment of taking the drugs. That is when the intervention can happen. Because to be honest, demand reduction, the idea of telling someone, look, do you really want to take this drug now that you know what it is? Well, the amount of drugs that we had handed back to us, we were going, no, I don't want to take that. Okay. That's what the government wants. That's what a lot of people want, for people to take less drugs. Fine, we can do that by telling them immediately beforehand that's the thing. Okay? So that's my call. For harm reduction, to be serious about doing something before people take drugs and not pick up the piece afterwards.